Professor Simon Otjes, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. The October 29 elections produced a near tie between D66 and PPV, symbolizing not a populist collapse but a recalibration of its appeal. From your perspective, does this outcome signify a stabilization of populism within an institutionalized party system, or rather its transformation into a normalized mode of political contestation across Europe?
So what I think is very important to note about the election results is that although the PVV lost more than 10 seats, the other populist parties that we have in the Netherlands, we've got two other populist radical right-wing parties in the Dutch parliament, they both won. So if you look at the combined share of seats for the populist parties, they just really stabilized. But in the previous elections, the votes were really concentrated on one party, the PVV, and now it's relatively more spread around the PVV, the radical right-wing populist PVV, and Ja21, which in some respects is more right-wing where it comes to economics, but also more moderate where it comes to the use of anti-Islamic and anti-elite rhetoric. And Forum for Democracy, a party that, according to specialists, is an extreme right party, and it really borders on anti-democratic in the sense that some of its members have been sanctioned for inciting violence, some of its MPs, and that some of its members have recently been found to be involved in even plots to assassinate politicians. So in that sense, we can see a total stabilization, but both voters going to more moderate versions of the radical right and to more extreme versions.
All right. You have described the Dutch system as one of the fragmented pluralism. How does this structural fragmentation affect both the endurance and the moderation of populist actors, such as the PVV and JA21? Could the Dutch case exemplify how fragmentation simultaneously limits and sustains populist influence?
So, I mean, the Netherlands, we had a government with populist parties between 2024 and 2025, and that fell because of internal instability. But that doesn't mean that now populism won't play a role in the government formation. There are two possible coalitions that people talk about. The one would be a coalition of all the parties in the center, from Green Left Labour Party, which is on the center left, to the VVD, which is on the center right. And the other alternative would be what the Liberal Party calls the center-right government, but which would involve D66, a center-left party, the CDA, a center-right party, the VVD, a center-right party, and then Ja21, the more moderate radical right-wing populist party in the Netherlands. And that shows, and that is a serious contender. It's a question of whether they will get 75 or 76 seats. It's the first preference of the Liberal Party, so the VVD. And that means that even though Jette proudly said on election night that he has beaten Wilders, and this is the end of the Wilders era, it actually means that the chances are large that another radical right-wing populist party will enter government, even governing with the social liberals who so proudly said that they had beaten the populists on election night.
Right. As mainstream parties increasingly adopt effective, emotionally resonant campaign styles, such as Rob Rieten's positive populism, do we witness the diffusion of populist communications logics into liberal centrism? And what might this imply for the future boundaries of populism as a concept?
So I want to know that I don't think that Jette is a populist, and nor did he really operate with populist rhetoric. What was striking was sort of that he adopted a yes we can kind of orientation from the Obama campaign, so that still resonates deeply with segment of Dutch voters. But what he did do is he positioned his party much more conservatively on the division between cosmopolitans and nationalists. So there he took a much more centrist position compared to his party previously, and that was more than a change in policy, a change in rhetoric. So you could see him speaking out against asylum seekers who break the law, but also that he positioned himself in debates in between the far left and the far right on this. And then on election night, the room of D66 was filled with little Dutch flags. So you can see that the D66 felt the need to sort of adopt a more nativist tone, a less extreme cosmopolitan tone in its positioning. It's not necessarily nativist, it's more like adopting a kind of progressive patriotism. And that was instrumental in my view in how they won, because they were able to appeal to center-right voters by no longer positioning D66 as a very extreme party on the cosmopolitan side, but more a party that's more centrist on this dimension, which shows that inevitably the discussion about immigration, the importance of the cultural dimension in the Netherlands, have not been blown away by the defeat of the populists. I mean, we can actually see that the only way that the social liberals were really able to win the elections is by really co-opting part of sort of the flag waving and the more anti-immigration rhetoric, in particular where it comes to asylum seekers.
Right. In your work on government alternation and satisfaction with democracy, you argue that meaningful alternation underpins democratic legitimacy. Given the repeated exclusion of PVV and its allies from governing coalitions, could this exclusionary dynamic paradoxically reinforce perceptions of elite closure and deepen democratic alienation?
Yeah, so when it comes to the voters of the PVV, they've been able to sort of access government only 2 times in the last 20 years. That is between 2010 and 2012, when the PVV tolerated the center-right government, and between 2024 and 2025, when they were part of a radical government. And so, in that sense, these voters are excluded from government participation, and we know that that is not good for their satisfaction with democracy. And we also know that that means that the PVV increasingly is a party of people who are dissatisfied with how democracy functions, which, from the perspective of the future of democracy, satisfaction with democracy is seen as political scientists as a very important variable in sustaining it. On the other side, we saw that when they governed, they didn't necessarily undermine institutions like courts and they also undermined coalition cooperation. So in that sense, it is a very difficult bargain. On the one side, co-optation of the radical right into government is a way to sort of signal to their voters that their choice matters. But on the other side, their involvement in government also undermines democratic principles.
Right. Relatedly, your research on coalition governance and frustrated majorities suggests that complex multi-party arrangements can generate their own legitimacy deficits. Might a centrist D66-led coalition risk reproducing the very disaffection it seeks to contain, despite its pluralist intentions?
Yeah, so I think that a centrist government, so a government would include GroenLinks Partij van de Arbeid, the D66, the VVD, and the CDA, although on substance they might be able to negotiate very well, because these are all parties with government experience. The danger of such a government is what that would mean in the long term for where dissatisfied voters can go to. So these parties will need to make compromises. These parties will, and because they're so broad, those will end up being quite centrist compromises, and then lack the change that these parties promised in their coalition manifestos. And then in turn, that would mean that voters will grow frustrated, and that in the Netherlands, given that the largest opposition party will be the PVV, frustrated voters will flock to the PVV. And so in many ways, a large government of the center might seem promising now, and it's certainly what D66 wants, because they want to have both left-wing and right-wing parties in a government. But it's very unattractive for the long term, because dissatisfied voters can only flock towards the radical right under those conditions, and rather you would have a situation where at least one of the traditional parties of government is in opposition, because that then can attract some of the voters that are dissatisfied with this government.
Right. Drawing on your findings on anti-elitism and local political space, do the 2025 elections reveal a contest between technocratic centrism, embodied by D66, and localized anti-elitism, expressed through populist and regional currents? How do such competing modes of representation reshape the Dutch democratic fabric?
So, I think it's important to note that in the study about localism and populism, we didn't find, at least at the party manifesto level, that those two were necessarily strongly related. Or I didn't find that. So I want to stay away from a picture where anti-elitism is concentrated in some regions. But rather, what we find is that there is political dissatisfaction both in major cities as there is in more rural areas. And so while we do find some evidence for specific forms of regionalized dissatisfaction, what seems much more likely now is that general political dissatisfaction played a major role in at least why voters voted for the PVV. So in that sense, I would want to stay away sort of from an image where one is more local and one is more national. I do agree sort of with this idea that we are seeing sort of two different modes of governance in the Netherlands. One is sort of the centrist governments that end up being quite technocratic, that end up having to compromise, quite gray compromises where all the different colors are mixed up and there's no clear political expression, clear political sort of policy choices by the government anymore. And those are then alternated by brief periods of radical right-wing populist government. That would be a good way to describe basically the Netherlands in, let's say, the last 30 years, where we had a centrist government between 1994 and 1998, followed by 1994 and 2002, followed by a populist moment in 2002 with the LPF. They couldn't govern, that government fell apart. Then we had different centrist governments until 2010, when the VVD was willing to govern with the PVV in the 2010-2012 minority government. That fell apart, was followed by again a centrist liberal Labour coalition. And then sort of we had different sort of centrist coalitions until 2024 when we had the Schoof government. So basically what we have are periods of quite grey technocratic centrist government, alternated then by the radical right governing in 2002, 2010, 2012, and 2004, 2025. Very short periods because they've proven so far not to be very reliable partners. And so this appears to be the pattern that the Netherlands is stumbling in, an alternation basically of centrist government that isn't very inspiring, followed by brief periods of radical right-wing dissatisfaction, which isn't able to really deeply influence government policy because of the instability of those governments.
Right. Your research with Green Pedersen shows how party competition drives issue salience. Have the 2025 elections further diffused the immigration debate across the party spectrum, eroding the PVV's ownership of the issue? If so, what new issues might sustain populist mobilization going forward?
So, although I don't really have the numbers right now, because actually students are going to start coding the manifestos for 2025, I don't think the PVV has lost its issue ownership on migration. Rather, what you would see if you would ask voters is that a large share of the voters still thinks that the PVV has the most promising positions on migration. And rather, the voters sort of went to different parties, mainly because the PVV was excluded from government, and therefore voters that wanted to influence government policy could no longer vote for the PVV. It was more an expressive vote, anti-immigration vote. And that meant that, in particular, Leiden University, which is much more likely to enter the government coalition than the PVV, was a good alternative for voters who, on the one side, wanted a change in migration policy, and on the other side, wanted to have a chance to influence the government policy. So that is sort of why that party won, because its ability to appeal to voters who are dissatisfied with migration policy but do want to influence the government, which the PVV seems unlikely to.
Right. You have observed that populism adapts rather than disappears. Does the simultaneous decline of the PVV and the rise of smaller radical right parties like JA21 and FVD represent ideological splintering or a strategic diversification ensuring the persistence of the populist bloc?
So it would be difficult to really assign a strategy to it, but what we can see is sort of that the vote was previously very strongly concentrated on the PVV is now dissipated into three different parties that represent sort of three different ways of doing politics. So that is Leiden University, which still has radical right-wing positions, but we can really debate to what extent this party is populist. Does it really use the anti-rhetoric? Does it really appeal to sort of this idea between a united population that is virtuous and an elite that is invirtuous? Rather, this party seems to want to be part of the government, so they don't really use this kind of anti-elite rhetoric, but they have very clear anti-immigration stances. And so that is a party that at least appeals to voters who want to influence government policy. Now, it's still a large segment. I mean, it's still according to Vels, the second party of the Netherlands, voters for the PVV, despite their inability to govern. In many ways, that party performed well among voters who are dissatisfied with migration, who are dissatisfied with politics, mobilizing a very traditional radical right and populist base. And then the third party is FAD, which is much more extreme, as I pointed out at the beginning. And then also that appeals to a different sort of segment of the electorate, ones that has sort of ended up in these kind of news environments that are very different from the mainstream media, where sort of conspiracy theories are much more common. And I think it's particularly notable and worrying from a democratic perspective that the FAD grew this much. They were shunned by traditional media under their previous leader, Baudet, and then they changed their leadership without changing their manifesto, or to great distance from, for instance, the MP who was sanctioned for inciting violence. And then they changed their leader. It was sort of a more acceptable face, and then suddenly the media cordon that Baudet had faced disappeared. I think that is really worrying, because this party now more than doubled its seat total, despite taking very extreme positions and harboring the kind of membership that is really what seeks to undermine democracy. So in that sense, I wouldn't necessarily talk about strategy here, but I would emphasize that there are different parties on the radical right that can appeal to different groups. And that is the key explanation of why they remain so stable, is sort of their ability to appeal to very different electorates by diversifying their offering.
Right. In light of your work on religious parties and immigration attitudes, how do you interpret the enduring moral and cultural anxieties that underpin populist narratives in an increasingly secular and urbanized Netherlands?
They were quite simple. So the question is, what is the relationship between religion and these cultural attitudes? And there I have to be a little bit skeptical, in the sense that in the Netherlands, religious attitudes and cultural attitudes aren't strongly coherent. And we could also see that in a party landscape. So there are 3 Christian democratic parties currently in parliament. That is the SGP, which is a very conservative Protestant party. It's the CDA, the mainstream Christian democratic party, that did quite well in the elections, and the ChristenUnie, more center-left Christian party, in particular when it comes to environmental and economic issues. And so on migration, the SGP isn't really differentiable from the radical right. They take very clear radical right and populist, the radical right in positions without being populist. Very, very strongly anti-immigration, anti-Islam, believes Christianity is superior to Islam. Then the CDA takes much more centrist positions. They favor measures against migration, in particular, citing that the Netherlands can't really handle that much migrants, so without sort of veering into nativist territory, but they are quite conservative where it comes to migration. And they, for instance, supported the principles of the far-going migration bill that was introduced by the previous government. They voted against it for a few amendments, but not because they disagreed with the principles in there. And then there's the ChristenUnie, which is much more progressive on migration. Really is a party of the kind of churches that want to help refugees in this country. And so the diversity shows that in the Netherlands, there isn't necessarily a strong relationship between migration attitudes and voting for different Christian democratic parties. Rather, the Christian democracy shows different shades.
Right. In From Eurorealism to Europhilia, you trace D66 evolution toward a more assertive pro-Europeanism. Does Rob Jetten's victory reflect a genuine societal re-legitimization of the EU in Dutch political discourse, or is it a contingent reaction to populist overreach?
I mean, so we have to really note here that Jetten didn't win the elections sort of as a change, because the population in the Netherlands changed their opinion. Populations about migration or about the European Union in the Netherlands are surprisingly stable. And rather, if anything, we can see that Jetten appealed to voters by becoming more centrist on this issue. So this traditionally very pro-European party decided to have a big Dutch flag during their party conference, sort of signaling that they wanted to move away from sort of the cosmopolitanism that was associated with them. So I wouldn't necessarily see his victory as anyway as sort of a change in opinion about the European Union, or even a change of opinion about migration. Rather, it's about a party strategically positioning itself on these issues to appeal to a larger segment of voters. That doesn't necessarily mean that Dutch policy about, for instance, the EU won't change. You've had a very Eurosceptic government, also a government that was really unable to influence European policy because the prime minister wasn't tied to one of the major party families, was an unknown in Brussels. And so I think that the Netherlands will play a more active role in the European Union, depending on how the government formation will turn out. Also a more positive role where it comes to where the Netherlands, particularly issues where the Netherlands have been quite conservative, such as budgetary expansion. At the same time, despite the D66 entry into government, it seems very likely that the VVD will also be in government, and that a government with the VVD will mean a government that inevitably will also move against too large increase in the European budget or too expansionary policies. They are fighting a rearguard battle against increasing role for the EU when it comes to these matters. So in that sense, the Netherlands won't necessarily be the most progressive government on this issue.
Right. Your study of Volt highlighted the rise of transnational Europhile populism. Could D66 success, with its emotional charge yet pro-European message, indicate a broader continental trend toward the hybridization of populism and cosmopolitanism?
I really want to emphasize that both in the study about Volt and in the study by D66, I did not claim that these parties are populist. I wouldn't necessarily call them populist. They don't make this differentiation between the people and the elite. And D66 is rather a traditional party of government that was able to mobilize on dissatisfaction with the current government, but not necessarily appealing to broader dissatisfaction with democracy even. So no, I don't think there's any basis to sort of calling these parties populist. These parties are, I mean, D66 was quite good at running this campaign, adopted a more progressive patriotic message, but there's nothing about them that makes them populist. The same is true for Volt.
Right. How might the Dutch election reshape the EU's political equilibrium, particularly in debates over migration, democratic reform, and responses to illiberalism? Is the Netherlands now positioned to play a normative role in defending liberal democratic values within the Union?
So I think we really have to differentiate migration from the debate about illiberalism. So where it comes to migration, all the parties in parliament, with perhaps exception to the very small ones, all really support the European Migration Pact. And that is even seen by the parties of the left, such as D66 and Populism Studies, as a solution to sort of their migration problem. They really make it a European problem. So there's broad support for those kinds of measures, including dealing with refugees in third countries, including making deals with third countries, which is really seriously doubted by legal scholars whether those kinds of things are in line with refugee conventions. But that's what they should be supporting as a way, as an answer to the migration problem. But when it comes to the discussion about illiberalism, the Netherlands really didn't need to play any role, because the discussion about illiberalism is really sort of dealt with by the fact that there are different countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, that are willing basically to tolerate each other's illiberalism, and that these kinds of moves against illiberalism require unanimity. So in that sense, the Netherlands, the changing government in the Netherlands hasn't really changed anything. I think that the Schoof government might perhaps be a little more accepting of illiberalism than the previous governments, but it's important to note that both NSA and VVD, which were in that government, both were really sort of parties that favored sort of a maintenance of the rule of law and movements against illiberalism. So in that sense, I don't think that a change in government will mean a lot for these discussions, in particular because it's just all about Hungary, Slovakia, and then soon also Czechia, and the numbers continue to do also Poland, sort of allowing an area of illiberalism within the European Union. So in that sense, I don't think that necessarily the change in government would affect this at the EU level.
Right. Building on your research with Bedog on the populist challenge to democracy reform, how do you interpret the PVV's brief period in power? Has it intensified mainstream reflection on the tension between majoritarian responsiveness and liberal constraint in Dutch democracy?
No, I don't think that sort of the PVV's participation in government has really changed views about democracy. What we can see is that the NSA, which was one of the government parties, pushed an agenda of government reform, including a change in the electoral system, that the previous government was quite open to the introduction of the referendum in the Netherlands. And that the interesting thing is now is what will happen on those portfolios, basically. In particular, because the VVD and CDA are quite skeptical about, particularly for instance, the introduction of a referendum. And so that is a big question. there was quite an ambitious reform agenda that was stalled because the government only lasted that long. And it really is a question of what kind of reform agenda they will adopt. I mean, what you can see in the centrist parties in the Netherlands is sort of this idea that they might want to make some changes, that they understand that Dutch democracy needs to be reformed, but there isn't sort of a clear, they don't really feel united around one agenda. And that is what is notable about particularly the participation of NSA in the previous government, is that they had a very clear agenda, but is now associated with them. So I don't expect that the next government will do anything in terms of major changes like electoral reform. I really have sincere doubts about whether the referendum, the referendum bill that already progressed to Parliament is going to be stalled even longer. So I don't think that this will lead to any major changes of the way democracy functions in the Netherlands.
Across Europe, we observe a convergence between adaptive liberal centrist and fragmented populist right formations. Do you see this dynamic producing a long-term hybridization of democratic politics, where populist effect and centrist rationality coexist as dual pillars of contemporary representation?
So I think that's sort of this description where you have this alternation between almost technocratic centrist governments, often including parties, the center left and the center right, having to govern together, leading to compromises that where you can't really see the colors of the party anymore, being interrupted by brief periods of radical right-wing governments because the radical right is turned incontournable. I think that is a pattern that we can now see at least for the last 30 years, and that seems that I can see no basis for sort of another pattern than that. So you would continually have sort of these centrist governments that try to deal with the issues, but because of their breadth inside the government, aren't really able to deliver very clear either left or right-wing policy solutions, and then being interrupted by different forms of government with the radical right. We saw the government with the LPF in 2002, the tolerated government in 2010, and now the Schoof experiment. And then I think we'll just continue to sort of have this alternation between these two options.
And finally, Professor Otjes, when viewed globally, from Trump's America to Milei's Argentina and Meloni's Italy, do the Dutch elections signify the emergence of a post-populist phase characterized by ideological diffusion and strategic normalization, or do they mark merely another turn in populism and during cycle of reinvention?
Yeah, so I don't think we can talk about a post-populist phase. I think what we can see here is that this sort of fits a pattern that we've seen before, where populists enter government, so governments prove to be unstable. That means that there's a response by the center that they want to govern together again. They do that for a while until again the populists become so large that they can't be ignored. That is the pattern that I'm seeing. So I wouldn't call this a post-populist phase. I think we're very much still inside this populist moment. I mean, when it comes to the diffusion, I really don't think that populism has diffused very strongly among the mainstream parties. I think you could argue that mainstream parties have moved to the center, or sometimes to more conservative sides where it comes to the VVD or migration. So there we can really see that populism is having a big influence. Radical right and populist parties are having a big influence in how parties make policy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are now in a post-populist phase. Rather, I think it will see this alternation of radical rights supported governments, these that briefly interrupt a more general pattern where the parties of the center have to govern together.
Professor Simon Otjes, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man.